described by its combined U.S. Air Force and civilian crew as Old Shaky, surrounded by nothing but frequently raging North Atlantic waters as far as the eye could see. The battered, stationary, offshore early warning radar platform, Texas Tower 4, was the epitome of hasty, cutting-edge Cold War experimentation on a massive scale. One of many plans to defend against escalating Cold War threats, the Texas Tower program went from what could have been a mere footnote in the history of early nuclear defense to a tragic, deadly, short-lived program that lives in infamy to this day. From We Are the Mighty, 5 towers were planned, 3 were built, 1 was doomed. Older, obscure, and occasionally a bit unsettling, you're watching the Lost at Sea series on Brick Immortar. The primary source for this video is the United States Investigative Subcommittee's 300-plus page inquiry into the collapse of Texas Tower No. 4, and a strong secondary source playing a major role is a summary titled The History of Texas Towers in Air Defense, 1952 through 64, by one Thomas W. Ray, created in March of 1965, just a few years after the incident. But being so significant, the historian's report was actually withheld from the public under Title 18 espionage laws until finally being declassified in December of 1972. The subcommittee's inquiry, our primary source, is a combination of transcripts during testimony from those directly involved in Tower 4's design, construction, and operation, summaries of the Texas Tower program's purpose, descriptions of evidence presented, conclusions and lessons learned, amongst all their other means of investigation. These hearings took place in May of 1961, just a few months after the Tower 4 incident, in January of that same year. As always, links to all sources, additional references, and featured media will be in the description. From the inquiry, quote, "The concept of fixed offshore radar platforms was first outlined in a report dated August 1, 1952, by Lincoln Laboratory of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. The report found that such structures were possible if we used shoals that were known to exist 80 to 100 miles off the northeast coast. Accordingly, Lincoln Laboratory recommended consideration of facilities suggested by the original Texas Towers, a nickname for oil drilling platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, to be placed at 5 selected locations in North Atlantic shallows. The Cold War had escalated into a nuclear arms race, and early warning systems used to detect nuclear-capable, long-range Soviet bomber aircraft were being given priority, especially along the U.S. eastern seaboard. Various picket ships, vessels fitted with radar, along with early warning aircraft were seen, according to the Air Force and MIT, as unreliable when compared to the potential of a fixed-position, land-based radar system installed to monitor the same areas. In addition, the upcoming cutting-edge SAGE system, or semi-automatic ground environment, now legendary in Cold War lore, would revolutionize the networking, processing, and coordination of this, at the time, massive amount of info retrieved from each radar site connected to it, which also included the Distant Early Warning, or DEW line, all feeding data into massive banks of computers located in secure facilities. According to the inquiry's report, unlike the picket ships and early warning aircraft, the fixed radar on the Texas Towers would be linked automatically through this SAGE system. This crucial information gathered offshore would potentially no longer be subject to the delays, errors, and inconsistencies that were thought to have plagued the cumbersome process of ships, aircraft, onshore stations, multiple points of communication, and overall shorter detection ranges that came with not being fixed in place or land-based. The Distant Early Warning, or DEW line, of land-based radar installations would cover the northernmost latitudes, for example, while the Texas Tower program would cover the northern Atlantic. Hopes were high for the program's ocean-based warning areas, with expectations for them to span hundreds of miles each, up to 50,000 feet in altitude, and grant a 30-plus minute advanced warning of approaching enemy bombers. Crewed by dozens who would work on board for weeks at a time, the towers were planned to become their own little isolated, stationary world in the middle of a vast, unforgiving, violent ocean. This channel is fully independent. We take no sponsorships on videos like these, and it's because of viewers like you we can keep doing these deep dives with such a high standard of research and production. To support the production of these videos, get Brick Immortar artwork, hoodies, mugs, patches, and more at brickimmortar.com. Get listenable podcast audio-only versions of each episode and more at patreon.com/brickimmortar. Links will be in description and pinned comment. Or simply subscribe to this channel and help spread the message that your safety matters. You might remember my previous video on the Ocean Ranger, a prime example of a floating, non-stationary, large platform that gives the impression of being fixed to the ocean floor on large columns. Yet the Ocean Ranger actually sat atop two massive pontoons, typically hidden below the waterline once the platform was in position. Technically, just a massive semi-submersible ship. In contrast, fixed platforms off the Gulf Coast were often nicknamed Texas Towers, and, similar to their namesake, the offshore radar stations would actually be affixed to the ocean floor with massive sunken columns. While the Texas Tower installations would be an Air Force program, the U.S. Navy would take point on the design and construction process. First, a feasibility study was contracted out jointly to the firms Moran, Proctor, Mooser, and Rutledge of New York City and Anderson Nichols of Boston. End quote. The Navy also made arrangements with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to furnish the architect-engineer wind and wave data. The architect-engineer study, which was completed on October 1, 1954, found that the Texas Towers were technically feasible and could be built. Work on detailed designs and specifications was begun shortly thereafter by contract between the Navy and the same architect-engineer. The report would go on to clarify, quote, "However, Towers number 1 and 5, for which the need was not considered to be as pressing, were not undertaken at that time, and thus Towers 2, 3, and 4 would be up for bid first." The location of these three played a crucial role in the bidding and construction process, though. While each was around 100 miles or less off their respective coastlines and built along the same Atlantic shelf, the ocean's depth at Tower 4's location posed significant challenges. Tower 2 would be just over 100 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, at a depth of around 55 feet. Tower 3 about 65 miles southeast of Nantucket, at a depth of roughly 80 to 86 feet, and Tower 4 some 63 miles south of Long Island, 85 miles east of New Jersey. The water at Tower 4, though, would be roughly 185 feet deep, 100 plus feet deeper than the other two. This led to a complex process of finding and assigning potential contractors. Each tower's platform and support columns were constructed in dry dock, with Texas Tower 2 being fabricated at Bethlehem Steel in Quincy, Massachusetts. And according to the investigative inquiry, both Towers 3 and 4 would be, quote, "fabricated and assembled in a shipyard in Portland, Maine." But keep in mind, not all at once either. This undertaking was on such a massive scale, each tower's realization would be spaced apart by a matter of months or even years. Indeed, the construction of each would be extremely complex, and in the case of Tower 4, exacerbated by the deeper water. Above the waterline, each platform was roughly similar in the now iconic triangular shape, size, and proportions. The contract to float out, embed, and assemble in place the first completed tower, Tower 2, was awarded jointly to Raymond Concrete Pile Company and DeLong Engineering, both out of New York City. Towers 3 and 4 were awarded jointly to both J. Rich Steers of New York City and Morrison Knudsen of Boise, Idaho. The legs were planned to hold each platform between 60 to 70 feet above the waterline. Each leg was actually a hollow caisson to be sunken or embedded into the seafloor, and thus these 12.5-foot wide columns would need to be long, extremely long. On Tower 2, for example, which was in about 50 feet of water, according to the historian's report, quote, "Each of the three tubular legs was designed for lasting support measuring over 160 feet long." So Tower 3, at a depth of about 85 feet, we can assume a total leg length of around 200 feet or so. But with Tower 4 being in 180 plus feet of water, these columns were much longer, at 252 feet in total, with staggered bracing planned below the waterline in, quote, 3 tiers of 24 and 30-inch steel struts. The only one of the 3 to contain this sort of additional reinforcement below the waterline. Perhaps the most significant change, though, would be, quote, Tower number 4 was handled quite differently from either of the other 2. On the other 2, the legs were put in the platform and towed to sea as part of the platform. So, essentially floated out vertically as one large unit.
Underway, the platform was towed by 2 tugs, each with a separate tow line to the platform. In the harbor, where maneuvering was necessary, there were also tugs pushing, but these dropped back when open water was reached. The tower soon passed the limits of Boston Harbor and slowly proceeded to sea. By this time, the tower was almost at its full height. Work was being speeded, for hurricane conditions were forecast, and the tower needed the permanent legs in place and secured for final strength. The storm was getting nearer. Personnel not vitally needed aboard the tower were evacuated using the basket, the only means of getting on or off the tower. The full force of the storm missed the tower, however, and work soon got back to normal. But the men were not breathing easily as yet, for the hurricane season was far from over. The temporary legs were no longer needed, so the jacks were lifted off, and one by one the brackets cut loose. The radio towers, the framework for the radomes, and 2 of the 3 heavy steel protective fenders are now installed. On November 17th, when the seas were getting rough, the tug El Sal and the smaller M. Moran arrived at the tower with an inspection party for what was to have been a 3-hour visit. As the inspection party was being hauled aboard the tower in the basket, the weather became worse. The seas had become so rough that the skipper of the M. Moran had to head for port. Finally, it got so bad that even the El Sal had to head for calmer waters, leaving the inspection party stranded on the new and untried Texas tower in the midst of a surprise northeaster. This storm developed suddenly and had winds of hurricane force, with waves over 60 feet in height. This would be a test of the strength of this new tower. During the night, the 2 fenders broke loose from their moorings, where they had been hoisted supposedly beyond the reach of the waves, and 80 tons of metal crashed against the legs of the tower. The ladder of the rotary scaffold was caught in a lowered position and was ripped loose. But the tower itself had withstood the worst North Atlantic storm in years. Here is the Air Force Station, Georgia's Bank, as she stands today. A lonely sentinel guarding against a sneak attack.
The inquiry continues. On Tower 4, the legs were towed separately, and the platform was towed separately. After the legs, floated out horizontally, were upended and in position, then the platform was floated in between these legs, and these gates were closed in order to grip the platform for raising it. Since this structure was fabricated in Portland, Maine, it was necessary to tow both the template and platform some 350 miles through ocean storms to the site, which took approximately 7 days. And the, quote, template was the contractor's name for the rigged tripod of legs being hauled horizontally. July 4th, 1957. The chief engineer of the J. Rich Steers firm stated, quote, "At around noontime, we decided to prepare for upending the template. However, due to the time it took us to make the preparations, it became about dusk. At that time, the wind started to kick up, the seas started to increase, and it was then decided to hold off upending until July 5th, the next day. During the night of July 4th and early morning of July 5th, we had a fair amount of sea. We kept the template under tow, heading into the wind at all times, to diminish any effects the weather may have on the template. But the following morning it was observed that one of the diagonal braces on the AB side was broken off, and the other one was damaged. During July 5th, the weather was still bad, and we couldn't think of upending the template. It was during that time that I had a conversation with representatives of the Navy concerning these 2 diagonal braces as to what was to be done and what could be done. It was pointed out in the conversation that there were only 2 ways of doing the work. One was taking it back to Portland, putting it back in dry dock, and actually putting the braces back exactly as they had been when we left the yard a week or so before. The other was to have a design made by a competent architect-engineer and to install the braces under the water. It was also pointed out at the time by me, if we did go back to Portland, which we would have to do because it was the only dry dock at the time anywhere in the vicinity that could handle a structure of this size, we would not be able to implant the tower in 1957. It would have to be held over until '58. The decision was then made that we would go ahead with the upending and get a design for the installation of permanent braces underwater. From the inquiry, both the drawings and references throughout indicate the A and B legs are those on the shore-facing side of the platform, the C leg being the one pointed seaward. So the AB, or A to B side, refers to the legs directly underneath the primary, multi-level portion of the superstructure with radars atop, along with the cross-bracing accordingly. However, the issues discovered during installation wouldn't stop there. This unique process of upending and securing Tower 4's legs also appeared at some point to have created a dishing effect. Quote, right at the waterline on all three legs was a flattened effect, or dishing, approximately 10 feet in height, 6 feet in width, and about 10 inches in depth. In a separate statement, it was said to have caused damage to only the A and B legs. Quote, after the legs and braces were in position and during the platform installation, injury in the form of perceptible denting, or dishing, occurred to the A and B legs, caused by the rubbing action of the platform against the legs due to sea swells. These dents were in the nature of 10 inches deep. The rubbing action presumably refers to the platform carrying the template out to its location, experiencing rough seas. It is difficult to parse, but it appears that the upending or tip-up process may be the culprit in creating this flattened effect. The template making excessive contact along the A and B legs during the tip-up phase as the entire thing took on sea swells. When asked if this caused him any concern, the on-scene commander, who'd been present throughout the installation, stated, "It did at the time, more a feeling of what might have happened than what actually did." This is a direct quote given in retrospect, so I'm wondering if the intention of his statement meant he was more concerned about the long-term effects of this damage, what might have happened, rather than trying to discover how it happened in the first place. He'd follow up that statement though by saying, quote, actually the injury was assessed to not be too serious. It was reinforced inside and repaired in that way. And this was repaired by placing steel reinforcing in the concrete lining of the legs in the dished areas. Incidentally, DeLong, one of the firms responsible for Tower 2's embedment and installation, objected to the entire upending process being used for Tower 4. DeLong was also very vocal about the braces damaged in transit, stating, quote, "This, I would say, was quite a disaster." In addition, regarding the depth of the embedded footings into the seabed, it's suggested in the report by the U.S. Navy's captain of their Civil Engineer Corps, quote, Texas Tower number 3 is 60 feet. Texas Tower number 2 was 63 feet, and actually as built, the embedment of Texas Tower number 4 was only 18 feet, I believe. Regarding the seabed material, he'd continue, "It is my understanding that it was very hard sand in all three of these sites." So, similar seafloor material, but drastically different in their embedded footings. Towers 2 and 3 did not receive the same sort of bracing as Tower 4, which, according to the report, played a role in why the legs were embedded much shallower into the seafloor by comparison. It's noticeable throughout the report's testimony that these varying schools of thought on how each tower should be constructed played a major role in multiple firms being involved, even changing hands midway through the program. It appears to have caused much back and forth between designers, engineers, and their overseers, which would speak to the varying methods used to get these towers in place. From the historian's declassified report regarding Tower 4, quote, "Inside each steel leg was encased a 140-foot-long steel tube, 6 feet in diameter, where thousands of gallons of fluid reserves, mostly water and fuel oil, might be stored, surrounded by a jacket of concrete over 2 feet thick. One of the 3 hollow legs contained seawater tapped for conversion to drinking water. To this end, Distillation equipment was included for producing several gallons of fresh water per minute. And we will get into more detail on crew, accommodations, and much more. But before we dive into that, I'd like to zoom back out for a moment and provide the timeline of each platform's physical completion. The main purpose here is because, while one tower would be completed, the contractors and Navy would be simultaneously working on the next, and so forth. It would get very confusing to continue jumping around while trying to tell these sequences in chronological order, so I ask you try to keep the following overview in mind as we continue. From the inquiry, Tower 2 would be completed in November of ~55, with a construction cost of just over $12.3 million. Tower number 3 was completed in May of '57 at just over $10 million, and Tower number 4 was completed in November of that same year, 1957, with a construction cost of nearly $12 million when factoring in the added bracing repair cost. Each tower was designed from the beginning to withstand, quote, winds up to 125 miles per hour and waves of up to 35 feet in height. However, a massive amount of trial and error, troubleshooting and learning as they went, took place from the time the first tower, Tower 2, was handed off to the Air Force to begin operations. Unforeseen issues would plague these installations. From We Are the Mighty, quote, by the end of 1955, the first tower, TT2, began radar operations. Its 3 radar domes, or radomes, were programmed to detect targets of B-47 size, flying about 50,000 feet up to 200 nautical miles away, and the B-47 Stratojet being a U.S. bomber similar in radar cross-section to the Soviet equivalent. Quote, unfortunately, it was only after the tower was in place that the U.S. Air Force found low-altitude radar gaps in the tower's range. The same targets flying at low altitudes, around 500 feet, were only noticeable by radar up to 50 nautical miles away. Airborne early warning and control aircraft still needed to patrol the oceans to provide adjunct coverage to the Texas towers. And from the inquiry, quote, in order to supply the towers with men and supplies, it was necessary for us to equip an old Coast Guard cutter of some 1,100 tons in weight, which ran between the mainland and the tower. We used a basket-like platform set on a rubber tube, which we called a donut, for hoisting the men from the supply ship to the platform. During rough weather, many personnel had a ride that could not have been duplicated at an amusement park. We were fortunate in all our operations, loading and unloading, not to have injured anyone. Like so many other Cold War experiments on the bleeding edge of technology and engineering, techniques and technology were evolving rapidly. It was discovered early on in getting Tower 2 up and running, quote, the metal superstructure seemed to vibrate constantly. This was reportedly from the non-stop spinning of the primary radome antennas, the diesel generators, along with other equipment, and quote, standing like a 3-pronged tuning fork, the tower resonated with noises that spread farther and amplified greater than initially occasioned by their source. Matters were not improved when, every half-minute or so during the frequent fogs, the dismal-sounding foghorn croaked out its forlorn message. Referring to the construction of Tower 4 at such a depth, from an informational film presented during the inquiry hearings, quote, it is important to know that never before this time had a similar operation been attempted, much less completed. One important thing was to pick a time of year in which we could be relatively sure of a fairly calm sea, in order to erect the tower before the advent of the hurricane season. In fact, in the case of Texas Tower number 3, a hurricane passed within 100 miles of the construction site, only 7 days after we arrived. Undoubtedly, we were very lucky in this instance, because if this hurricane had changed its course a degree or two to the west, it would have completely destroyed that tower. Regarding Tower 4, the inquiry states, quote, the superstructure was a triangular platform, 66.5 feet above sea level, approximately 180 feet on each side. The weight of the entire structure was some 7,000 tons. Its overall height from the ocean floor to the top of the radomes was 345 feet, roughly that of a 30-story building. Logistics and crew. Activated in October of 1956 was the 4604th Support Squadron out of Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. This unit would provide logistical support necessary for the Texas Tower mission: fuel oil, food, materials, spare parts, and ferrying the crew back and forth made up the majority of their duties. There would eventually be 2 H-21B workhorse helicopters per tower, and that original cutter, New Bedford, would continue in its tower support role, supplemented by 2 additional ships to share the load. The helos were modified for both operations over water and to maximize passenger capacity. It's been reported ferrying crew back and forth via helicopter was much preferred over the crane and ship method. And from the U.S. Air Force Helicopter Pilots Association, or USAF HPA, the H-21 helos were eventually replaced by the Sikorsky S-61. I can't find the capacity of their modified H-21s, but it appears, according to the Pilots Association, the replacement S-61s could haul up to 28 crew members at once. And as an aside, this Texas Towers emblem on screen is actually that of the 4604th Support Squadron, and these two are the unique emblems for Towers 2 and 3. However, we've not been able to dig up what Tower 4's logo looked like, which is a bit sad for an old detail junkie like me. The patch with the Latin for "We Are Ready" is also in a way credited for being the de facto emblem for the overall mission in our modern times. So we've used it in place of that Tower 4 logo on our 3D model. Seemed kind of fitting anyway. According to the inquiry, assessing onboard crew requirements proved a difficult task from as far back as the program's conception. With this completely new and unique program came new and unique tasks. Making it more complex was that many functions aboard each platform, even much of the day-to-day stuff, was more akin to tasks on board an ocean-going vessel, and yet these installations would be operated by the Air Force. The inquiry states, inside the platform, living space was provided for 75 enlisted personnel and 8 officers, complete with a galley and mess hall. The mess hall was used not only for eating, but for recreation, and contained a television set which picked up many programs from shore. We also equipped a room as a sick bay to take care of the men permanently assigned. Whereas the historian's report goes into a little more detail, stating, the bottommost deck was employed mainly for maintenance and storage space, where tanks and pumps were located. The next deck was partitioned into living quarters, a galley and mess hall, administration offices, heating and air conditioning areas, recreational areas, food storage space, a dispensary, and library. The Air Defense Command, or ADC, was the U.S. Air Force's subdivision overseeing the Texas Towers mission. And according to the report, quote, in mid-1956, after the first tower was erected, the staffing structure was hiked from 46 to 49 total officers and airmen for sustaining Texas Tower missions. Even this later proved inadequate by 5 spaces, as evidenced by a staffing pattern in 1957, calling for a total of 54, composed of 6 officers and 48 airmen. Aside from supply deliveries, each platform had to be self-sustaining, which included many tasks. Of course, there was radar surveillance, control, and communications, but to keep the installations operational also required specialties like plumbing, heating, refrigeration, medical, mechanical, electrical, distillation, cooking, and especially unique to the Texas Towers were specific maritime duties, which required the creation of positions new to the Air Force at the time, like classifying 1 or more staff sergeants as seaman, along with airman first-class ranks being trained into the Marine engine man role. Quote, so specialized were some of these maritime support jobs that ADC, until subsequently discouraged by the U.S. Air Force, showed interest in a 1956 proposal to transfer the entire Texas Tower program, operations, maintenance, and all, to the Navy Department. Now, this never took place, and in addition, the Air Force was also reluctant to grant the Air Defense Command's request to allow 2 full crews per tower, 1 on board for extended periods, while 1 remained ashore as relief to rotate in and so on. The Air Force higher-ups insisting on only 1.5 crews per tower. The ADC appeared to have moved forward with the plan for 2 full crews regardless. The on-duty crew would spend up to a month stationed aboard, divided into 3 shifts, so that detection equipment was operational and watching the skies 24 hours a day. After their weeks aboard were finished, the crew ashore would come on board as relief. And for those assigned, quote, tower duty incidentally counted as time aggregated on an isolated overseas tour. The crews aboard reportedly became well known for culinary skills like baking fresh breads and just overall kitchen improvisation required in those inhospitable, often lonely environments that became crucial to sustaining morale.
They baked their own bread and gave her a freshly baked loaf to take back to the mainland. She also learned that some of the crew would make rings out of 50-cent coins.
I'm impressed. This is terrific.
You can have it if you want it.
For real?
I can make more.
As of this moment, I am engaged to the crew on Texas Tower number 3. Thank you very much.
By late 1956, it's reported that Air Defense Command finally conceded to the U.S. Air Force's request to drop plans altogether for Towers 1 and 5, the Air Force eager to have the potential upcoming cost off the books for good. Texas Tower 3 was handed over by the U.S. Navy to the U.S. Air Force by May of 1957, and Tower 4 followed suit about 6 months later, becoming semi-operational in November of 57. By summer of 58, all 3 towers were fully in place, but their uplink to the SAGE system was still a ways off. Radar operations and communications to the mainland were being conducted in the meantime, quote, manually. They were up against a multitude of issues, making communication of radar data with onshore handlers difficult and sometimes impossible. Temperature inversions in the summer also caused, quote, loss of radar coverage, creating permanent echoes that obscured or distorted radar scope reception. And while the platform seemed large, when it came to so many massive pieces of radar and communications equipment, this was a rather cramped space. The electromagnetic interference discharged by each device caused them to interfere with one another, often disrupting operations and communications further. The increasing motions of Tower 4 caused by wind waves and its greater depth also caused radar issues. Radars that required a stationary, fixed emplacement to a very precise degree, with Tower 4's motion frequently beyond those precise limits. The ultimate goal, uplinking with the SAGE system, remained out of the question for the immediate future, and thus ongoing data transmissions continued manually via voice communications. The vibrations, weather, and wave-induced motion were a standard feature aboard each tower. However, in Tower 4's case, these issues caused so much concern that, as time wore on, detection uplinking and radar operations throughout the program began taking a back seat to the worry of those directly involved, whether Tower 4 and to an extent all 3 towers were structurally sound in the first place. Hurricane Daisy. It was August of 1958 when, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, quote, a system was first detected as a tropical storm 300 miles east-northeast of Miami on August 24th. Although the inquiry only makes one mention of Hurricane Daisy, and the historian's report doesn't mention it at all, upon digging further, it's stated in a June 1960 report by 2 U.S. Navy officers that this storm reached wind speeds of up to 120 knots, 138 miles per hour, that occurred within 8 to 10 miles of the storm's center. And when we look at NOAA.gov's historical track for Daisy, August 27th through the 30th of 1958, as the storm reached hurricane status, it appears as though the storm's center passed almost directly over Tower 4's location. From the inquiry, it was, quote, the summer of 1958, when the normal motion of the tower increased to the point that in September and October, after Hurricane Daisy, the Navy made an underwater inspection to ascertain the causes. The Navy divers found bracing connections loose at the 65-foot level, quote, on the shoreward or AB side of the tower. The inquiry continues. In November, the original construction contractor, J. Rich Steers, was recalled by the Navy to correct these deficiencies. During the winter of 58 through 59, before this work could be completed, the tower underwent 5 more storms, with maximum winds of 90 miles per hour and waves of 33 feet observed at the tower. It's mentioned in both the inquiry and historian's report that upon completion of the repairs by May of 59, quote, there was a noticeable reduction in the motion of the tower. An underwater inspection was made by the Navy at that time, which established that the repairs had been satisfactorily accomplished. Throughout that winter, late 1959, Tower 4 endured 4 more storms. Winds upwards of 75 miles per hour and 35-foot high waves battered the hapless radar station. By January of 1960, crews on board reported hearing noises from underwater, feeling, quote, abnormal motion, above and beyond the typical shaking and vibration. The Air Force requested the same dive team that the Navy had brought in previously to make yet another underwater investigation. The divers completed this task by February and discovered loose connections in the bracing again and on the same side, the AB plane at the 25 and 75-foot deep levels. Moran, Proctor, Musa, and Rutledge, the original designing architect and engineering firm, was contacted again. From the inquiry, quote, they recommended the installation of a system of above-water bracing. More specifically, quote, the design engineer said, this is an emergency. If we do not do something about this tower, we may lose it, unless something is done about it by August 1st. Following up, quote, this major project, which involved the expenditure of over $500,000, was completed by J. Rich Steers in August 1960, and the tower was certified by the architect-engineer as back to its original strength, capable of withstanding 125-mile-per-hour winds and 35-foot breaking waves. And, as a side note for reference, there are a couple indicators when looking at old photos that set Texas Tower 4 apart from the other two, at least in the later parts of its short life. The 2 tropospheric dishes, mounted behind the radomes, jutting out from the main structure, as compared to 3 I've seen in many photos on Tower 2 and 3. Whether one was damaged or removed, I'm unsure of the story there. But especially distinct were the braces underneath, just above the waterline, again added to Tower 4 only in August of 1960. Hurricane Donna. Less than a month after those above-water X braces were installed on Tower 4, a storm system that had formed near Cape Verde, Africa, crossed the Atlantic and was at hurricane strength by early September 1960 when it reached the tropical Atlantic, eventually sweeping across Florida, leaving chaos and destruction in its wake. It then headed back out to sea, tracking up the east coast. Hurricane Donna moved slightly ashore again along its northeasterly track. At its strongest, Donna had reached wind speeds of 160 miles per hour, Category 5, while it was in the tropics, and ravaged the Florida Keys with 140 mile per hour winds, Category 4. It's reported that all Tower 4 personnel successfully evacuated prior to Donna's arrival. And while the NOAA report states the hurricane was downgraded to Category 2 as it briefly made landfall across North Carolina, the storm, tracking back out to sea again, smashed into Tower 4 soon after, on September 12th, pounding the unfortunate platform with winds up to 130 miles per hour and breaking waves that exceeded 50 feet. The storm, quote, virtually destroyed a maintenance platform, also known as the Flying Bridge, and severely damaged other portions of the superstructure, as well as the newly installed above-water bracing. Another underwater inspection was required to assess the damage beneath the waterline, but the destroyed flying bridge on the bottom side of the platform was crucial to underwater operations. The Air Force brought the J. Rich Steers firm out again to replace the broken access platform. Quote, the platform was completed by November 1st, and underwater inspection began on the same day. Serious damage was discovered, all in the AB plane, in the upper 2 tiers of the underwater bracing. In the meantime, Towers 2 and 3 were being worked on frequently to improve tower-to-shore communications, as relaying information manually meant the towers were operating well below expectations. SAGE connectivity had remained lackluster, and experts in the field were doing all they could to make the radar stations fully operational. By 1960, quote, antenna realignments combined with improved maintenance, supply, training, and operating procedures enhanced tropospheric communications appreciably, and to all intents and purposes, rendered them satisfactory for SAGE as well as for manual operations. From multiple accounts, though, their operational status really did become secondary to the structural issues on Tower 4. The program's challenges also weren't limited to uplink problems, structural integrity, and design issues. In fact, they were also even more existential. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, were seeing rapid development throughout the 50s as well. Nuclear-capable multi-stage rockets with the potential to carry payloads into high-altitude, suborbital trajectories were far outside the Texas Tower program's detection capabilities. The end was near. It's not entirely clear whether Tower 4's radar operations continued, but after Hurricane Donna left the installation battered and beaten, pending repairs, by November of 1960, Command would reduce the crew on board to a minimum contingent of 14 Air Force personnel, along with the 14 civilian contractors present to carry out ongoing repair work, 28 on board in total. Serious damage had been discovered, again in the AB plane, upper two tiers of the underwater bracing. A plan was developed by the original design firm to install what would likely be X-style cable bracing underwater that would bypass the damaged tiers and potentially strengthen the A and B legs. In addition, it's reported other desperate attempts to stabilize the platform were also ongoing throughout the winter, like filling the legs with sand and concrete. As time wore on, winter weather conditions worsened, battering the tower further with vibrations and motions of the unstable platform so severe now that the remaining personnel on board would be routinely thrown to the deck if caught off guard, motions so violent that welders were having difficulty repairing the damaged legs. In this part of the Atlantic, winter temperatures average about 37 degrees Fahrenheit ambient and 32 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit in the water. And when Tower 4's instability became an obvious risk throughout the winter, the tower's commanding officer, Captain Phelan, made several requests to evacuate all personnel for their safety, to no avail. Despite having successfully evacuated for Hurricane Donna just a few months prior, Air Force leadership, quote, refused to abandon the tower, fearing that nearby Russian trawlers harbored spies eager to steal the radar technology. The unfortunate tower was weakened, some say to the point where it was at roughly half of its original structural integrity. From the inquiry, quote, on January 7, 1961, while underwater workers were readying the A and B legs for installation of the cable bracing, the first of which was scheduled for delivery later in that month, a new break was found in the lowest tier of underwater bracing on the A to B plane at the 125-foot level. This break may have been caused by a severe storm in December, which had winds up to 90 miles per hour and waves up to 40 feet. On January 12th, a meeting was held in the offices of the construction contractor with architect, engineer, and Air Force personnel in attendance. It was agreed that, as a result of the new break, a new or modified repair design would be necessary and more extensive work than originally contemplated would be required. It was also decided to complete certain work in progress and then suspend further repairs until the spring, when weather conditions would be more favorable for underwater work. From Time magazine, quote, now there were no more jokes about the tower's rock and roll. Its men called it Old Shaky, and the gag was grim with fear. All the talk was about getting ashore, in letters home and in calls via Air Force radio. Their growing terror spread to their families. The 28 still aboard, still without permission to make a timely evacuation. Sunday, January 15th, 1961. From the inquiry. Received a call from Henry on the tower at 4:40 p.m. I asked him how the weather was out there since it was raining, sleeting, snowing, and blowing on shore. He said that it was the same way out there. I asked him how the tower was acting. He said that it had been stormy since Saturday night, with northeast winds of about 60 knots and seas from the northeast now about 25 to 35 feet high. He said that the tower had been very steady up until 10:30 a.m. approximately, when there was a loud noise, that apparently something gave down below. I asked him what he thought it was, and Henry said that he didn't really know, and they couldn't go down to find out at this time. He said that since 10:30 a.m., the tower had begun to move and oscillate and seemed to have a rotary motion. I asked him how much he thought it was moving. He said about 50% of what it had around the middle of December 1960, and before the clamp at 75 feet deep had been installed. Henry also stated that they had completed welding and reinforcing of all cracks in the X-bracing above water, but that up until a little while ago, they had not been able to get on deck or the maintenance scaffold due to winds up to 60 knots. When he and the commanding officer had finally gotten down on the maintenance scaffold, presumably the flying bridge, as the wind let up a bit, they found a 20-inch vertical crack at the intersection where the interior vertical 5/8-inch thick gusset plates met the A-leg from the AB and AC sides. I asked if there was anything else they had observed, and he said no, because they couldn't move the maintenance scaffold due to the wind. I asked him what the weather reports indicated. He said that they were trying to get all reports available. They expected a lull in the morning, at which time they would try to get off by choppers, which had been alerted. What they were concerned about was a report that 2 lows were expected to combine off of Cape Hatteras and move up the next day. He said that the support cutter had been taking quite a beating trying to stay close to the tower in the heavy seas. Earlier that afternoon, according to We Are the Mighty, the platform's commanding officer, or CO, called his wife at about 1300 hours, or 1 p.m., and quote, "They had a long conversation. He told her that the tower was gyrating, a word he'd never used to describe the tower's behavior. He told her it was rough on board, and she believed he was especially concerned about the wind and waves. She asked him what would happen if the tower collapsed. He told her that it would not float. She asked if there were any watertight compartments. He replied, 'Absolutely not.'" Of course, swinging around in the donut to safely board the cutter New Bedford was also not feasible, with winds of 60+ knots and waves over 20 feet high. The cutter, though, on the assistance of their captain, was still in the vicinity holding station as best they could in the weather, prepared to render assistance regardless. During times of emergency, the platform's CO could order last-minute evacuation regardless of standing orders. However, by Sunday afternoon, the weather conditions were apparently too severe for emergency helicopter pickup. Winds had picked up to a reported 72 knots by about 3:30 p.m. When that civilian contractor, Henry Schutz, made that 4:40 p.m. call, he stated a loud noise occurred from below around 10:30 a.m. The platform's CO, Captain Phelan, also made a similar call to shore with his superiors at about 4 p.m., just prior to Henry's call, and also reported, quote, "He heard a loud noise and the tower sway increased. He thought another brace had broken, and there could be trouble if the wind direction shifted." His superiors advised him the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was, quote, "being diverted and would arrive sooner than choppers from shore." The CO called his wife once more at about 6 p.m. to let her know the Wasp was on its way and they'd be evacuated by helicopters. By then, waves were reported 35 feet high with 85-knot winds. According to We Are the Mighty, Henry had called into shore once more at 7:15 p.m., reporting that they'd made the deck ready for the carrier's helicopters, and stated, quote, "My next call to you will either be on the Wasp, or I will be in the sea. So long." Aboard the cutter, nearby, but far enough to be out of sight, the captain watched as Tower 4 disappeared from their radar screens. He transmitted to the Coast Guard that Texas Tower 4 had disappeared from radar and was presumed lost. From thetexastowers.com, 5 craft soon reached the scene: the Wasp, the destroyer F.T. Berry, the destroyer Norris, the destroyer Lloyd Thomas, and the destroyer McCaffrey. Helicopter and fixed-wing search of the area had to be postponed because of wretched weather and visibility conditions. It's been reported through various secondary sources, like thetexastowers.com, that once these vessels were on scene, where Tower 4 was supposed to be, there was absolutely nothing to be found on the surface. The destroyer McCaffrey was said to have heard metallic tapping noises from beneath the waves via their sonar receivers. One of the Navy ships immediately deployed shallow water divers to at least try and assess the tower's position underwater. Quote, "They determined the jagged edges of the tower were within 20 feet of the surface. In the luminous glow from the structure below, he was able to estimate that the mass of the tower was still lying parallel and nearby. Civilian divers were brought out to the WASP so a more thorough search and potential recovery could be attempted. At up to 180 feet deep, no small task, especially with large structures in unknown, unpredictable, and unstable positions beneath the waves. A potential overhead environment for divers." From the inquiry, one of the tower's marine contractors, who'd been presumably ashore at the time of collapse, stated, quote, "We were called in fact, at the very outset of the tower collapse. There was a feeling on the part of some of us that there possibly was some life still on the tower, even though it had been submerged. There have been many cases in the past of people living in submerged objects for some little time. We felt it was worth the risks involved to go out and endeavor to get into the tower to ascertain whether or not there was any life there. This we did, and found there was no life, and I personally do not believe there had been any life from the time the tower collapsed." From thetexastowers.com. In all, 4 men descended into the sea to look for signs of life on the sunken radar tower. These efforts resulted in definite proof that no one was still alive within the structure when the diving was carried out. Divers who opened the structure found no bodies but plenty of debris. The only direct evidence of the crew was found that Monday, January 16th, when the McCaffrey pulled the body of an Air Force Master Sergeant from the water, after his remains had been spotted by helicopters from the WASP. They also noticed another body floating, but it sank before they could recover it. 16 miles from the tower, searchers found one small boat, heavily smashed, and a capsized 35-foot motor whaleboat, a floating mattress, some loose debris, and the heavy smell of diesel oil and gasoline. After exhaustive searches and with survival factors to contend with, like near freezing water and no immersion suits, after having located no trace of survivors, all 28 souls aboard Texas Tower 4 were presumed lost. From thetexastowers.com. All evidence indicates that the men on the tower had been thrown into the sea without warning and with no preparation for the collapse. Even if there had been time to use lifeboats and other survival gear, however, it is unlikely that any man could have survived the overwhelming gale which was then blowing. Wreckage later picked up in the vicinity clearly indicates there was no time for an organized attempt to abandon the tower. And just to note, that last call from Henry Schutz, reportedly at about 7:15 p.m., states they'd made the deck ready for helicopter pickup. With the time of collapse estimated at 1920 hours, or 7:20 p.m., perhaps the crew were outside on deck, waiting when it suddenly collapsed. The same group of divers that confirmed the tower's underwater position would eventually survey the wreckage. From the inquiry, quote, "We found the tower wrecked to be some 200 yards at a bearing of 245 degrees from its original site. We found that 2 footings were fractured and that one had bent, the B caisson bent just above its footing. We found all 3 footings to be intact. We did not see or find any distortion that was evident at the time, nor do we feel that they were cocked out of a perpendicular plane with the ocean floor." With these drawings from the hearings, we can see that all 3 footings remained embedded. The A and C legs, or caissons, were found to have fractured right above their footings, and leg B bent right near its footing without fracturing. These findings aren't necessarily the initial failure, just what was found in the immediate aftermath. We will discuss probable cause in more detail later. But this tragedy, though, brought to the forefront a more abject, imminent risk, regardless of where blame would end up. That risk was Towers 2 and 3. Tower 4's failure was a huge story, almost immediately getting the attention of several local and eventually nationwide news outlets. At this point, it didn't matter the special circumstances of Tower 4, ocean depth, unique build technique. The potential failure of the other, presumably fully occupied platforms was now clear for all to see and required immediate action. According to a Captain White with the U.S. Navy Civil Engineer Corps, quote, "We were given a job by the Air Force to make an investigation to determine the seaworthiness of towers number 2 and 3. Associated with that job was a matter of extreme urgency, because there was a lot of concern, certainly, following the tragedy of Texas Tower number 4, as to what the condition of the other 2 towers was. Now, this concern was shared not only by the people that were on the towers themselves, but by the families of those people. This was a matter of urgency. So it seemed to me that the best people who were in a position to go out on those towers and specify and determine which parts of the towers should be thoroughly investigated to determine their structural accuracy was the firm that originally designed the towers." Captain White was asked by the subcommittee about this potential conflict of interest, quote, "Well, Captain, with all deference to the time element and the urgency of the matter, it appears from the record that the design engineers time after time have been consulted, and no one else, about repairs to Tower number 4. Now they are called upon by a new contract to evaluate their own work in Towers number 2 and 3. Now it is not very likely, is it, that they would admit that there was a design deficiency in Towers number 2 and number 3 if they found one?" This ended up in some very long-winded back and forth, debating the semantics of whether Moran, Proctor, Musser, and Rutledge were the proper party to perform inspections of the towers they had designed themselves. When asked once more, even more straightforward, quote, "But you honestly feel that by employing the original design engineers, you're going to receive a completely objective report of the structural stability of towers number 2 and number 3? The captain responded, "I have no question of it, sir. If I had any question of it, I would not have given them the contract." No matter their findings, though, the future of the Texas Tower program at this point was in serious jeopardy. The report we've read from, for much of this saga, the U.S. Senate's inquiry into the collapse of Texas Tower number 4, that hearing got underway May 3, 1961, at 10:10 a.m. in the U.S. Old Senate Office Building, just 4 months after the incident. The subcommittee, comprised of U.S. senators and their staff members, called up numerous parties to testify. Representatives from the Navy, the Air Force, architect engineers, contractors, divers. Quote, "Following an extensive investigation of the facts surrounding the collapse into the Atlantic Ocean of Texas Tower number 4 on January 15th of this year, the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee today begins a series of open hearings on the matter. What the subcommittee wants to know from sworn testimony of a number of pertinent witnesses is whether Texas Tower number 4 was properly designed, constructed, and kept in repair, and what were the circumstances which may have led to the collapse of the tower, by which 28 persons lost their lives. It is important to remember that we still have 2 Texas towers standing in the Atlantic, both of which have civilian and military crews aboard. We must give consideration to all safeguards which may need to be taken regarding these remaining radar platforms to avert another possible tragedy." Now, we've used much of the testimony provided during the hearing to reach this point in the video. To summarize, the hearings were long, arduous, and really painted a damning picture of ongoing issues with Tower 4's legs, braces, and overall design that stemmed from what appears to me the very beginning of installation. In addition, another factor that really came into focus during the hearings was the decision to use what are called pin connections, rather than welds connecting the web of braces between each leg. And just to note, there are no up-close images or drawings, at least that we could find, of these connections on the towers they're referring to. So, while we have plenty of testimony around the issue, it appears that not much publicly available imagery survived of these in detail. The chief structural engineer of Anderson-Nichols, the firm involved with the tower program's initial feasibility study, was critical of this connection method for Tower 4's braces, stating, quote, "Generally speaking, a welded connection is characterized by a greater rigidity than a pin connection. Sometimes it is advantageous not to have too much rigidity, and in that case, a pin is usually used. However, I believe that the whole subject of design there is too extensive to go into. It is certainly conceivable that any degree of rigidity could be obtained by any method, perhaps at a different cost. It is a matter of choice there. Regarding the pin connections, it would not normally be the choice where you were choosing rigidity as a desirable quality. Mr. DeLong of the DeLong firm, who was also critical of the upending process used during Tower 4's installation, stated, "We disagreed with pin connections. I would make it a little stronger. We did not want any part of it. Any part of it." It was also discovered by a testimony that the holes used for the pin connections were allowed to be increased in their design tolerance from 1/64th of an inch to 1/16th of an inch above the water and up to 1/8th of an inch below the surface. Now, tolerances in this instance refer to an allowable amount of variation of a specified quantity, especially in the dimensions of a machine or part. The increased tolerances were due to, quote, "The pin plates which were welded either to the braces or the legs became slightly out of line during fabrication. They were to be inserted at the site and therefore underwater, which at best makes for difficult insertion," which would explain why inspection divers were consistently finding loose pin connections, in addition to the more significant damage, each time after destructive weather events. Quote, "We tightened up the through bolts and substituted other bolts for the dartlet bolts, which multiple parties involved believed firmly that the new T-bolt or through-bolt types made a significant difference. However, it wasn't until after the first year of doing this the divers finally realized the excessive wear caused by the expanded tolerance in the holes. This was allowing the bolts or pins to continually shift more than expected under stress, frequently loosening them. It was also a point of contention as to whether the added X bracing above the water induced rather more stresses than rigidity to the platform toward the end of its life. One of the seasoned inspection divers from Marine Contractors Incorporated stated that he agreed the added above water bracing might have been putting more leverage on the caissons at their footings. Basically, by adding more surface area for those large waves to grab onto, you create a larger force at the top of the tower, and like a lever, this would likely be most felt at the very bottom, as those embedded feet hang on for dear life. Like standing straight up with your knees locked, while being pushed from one side at the shoulder, you will go too far past center line eventually to stay on your feet. He also stated that the emergency X braces were designed with rigidity and additional stability in mind, so in his opinion, the forces could, at the very least, have been offsetting enough to potentially be negligible during large waves. Probable cause. When pressed directly for his expert opinion as to probable cause, that same inspection diver stated, quote, "I feel the continual fracturing of the lower brackets and bracing was the ultimate cause, and very severe sea conditions." And he clarified this, stating, "I think the reason for this is a continually aggravated failure, that there just was not time enough to make the proper repairs before adverse sea conditions kept repeating themselves. I feel that repair by the installation of the X bracing was an effective attempt, that the designers had done all they thought they could within the time they had to rectify the damage that had been made by Hurricane Donna." A Captain Albers of the U.S. Navy's Civil Engineer Corps gave his input as to probable cause, stating, "I would say it failed because of the wave action being more than the design criteria. I think our original design criteria, if I had to do it over again, would be increased. I am told that when the tower failed, all the braces on this A-B side were broken and ineffective." However, he would also ask to be withdrawn from answering any questions regarding negligence in overall design or maintenance of those braces, with others, both civilian and military, designers and contractors, feeling it was not their place to provide input on probable cause. It's worth noting, the DeLong firm appeared to be one of the most outspoken when it came to Tower 4. Their work on Tower 2 meant they were closely involved with the program, even if they'd not been directly involved with Number 4. However, they'd also expressed their grave concern with being called to testify, even indirectly, in Tower 4's collapse hearing, voicing this through their counsel, stating, quote, "Unfortunately, since the DeLong Corp is preeminent in this field, there has been considerable confusion in the public mind as to its responsibility, if any. Business concerns, commentators, and others, both orally and in writing, have assumed that the DeLong Corp designed or erected the now collapsed Texas Tower No. 4, despite the fact that it was in no way involved. This has created some serious business problems for the DeLong Corp. While its officials will comply fully with the subpoenas of this committee, they are gravely concerned that the public may receive the impression from the fact that the committee has required their presence here, that they are in some way responsible for the disaster which occurred in January. It is therefore respectfully requested that the committee recognize on the record that the DeLong Corp was not directly or indirectly involved in the design or erection of Texas Tower No. 4. Mr. Anderson, the president of the firm Anderson Nichols, one of the two firms that was responsible for Tower 4, was asked directly, quote, "Do you have any opinion as to the adequacy or sufficiency of the structure as designed?" Mr. Anderson replied, "Well, I think that it is apparent to all that there were certain inadequacies, but I have no opinion. In other words, I did not participate in formulating the design criteria." Mr. Rutledge, of the other firm directly involved in Tower 4's design and construction, Moran, Proctor, Musser, and Rutledge, was asked, quote, "Based on any reports that you had before or after it fell, what have you learned about this original construction being in accord with your specifications?" To which he responded, "I think the major thing that we have learned is that the sea conditions in an extreme storm or hurricane can be much greater than anyone thought they could be at the time of the original design." In my opinion, this was the most definitive response, with everyone remaining otherwise rather neutral during questioning. Keep in mind, while these hearings weren't meant to establish or exonerate guilty parties, one might see where those directly involved in Tower 4's installation would be cautious in their answers. As for the historian's report, for what it's worth, it states, quote, "About 1920 hours, 7:20 p.m., the night of January 15th, one of its 3 legs snapped in half. The remaining 2 thereupon broke too, and the platform, with all hands aboard, sank to the ocean's bottom." The ending of an era. Towers 2 and 3 were still operational, even as the initial hearings concluded, casting an unavoidable shadow over the proceedings. Dozens of military and civilian crews still at risk, installations still struggling to provide reliable data, intercontinental ballistic warheads that could potentially go unnoticed over fixed radar installations like these. The program's days were numbered, and in the meantime, all souls still aboard were at risk. 2 months prior to the May 1961 hearings in March, a lieutenant general of the Air Defense Command declared, quote, "At this time, there is no valid reason for abandonment of Texas Towers No. 2 and 3. However, in view of the inherent danger and the current inability to evacuate safely during storm conditions, this headquarters, in conjunction with Headquarters NORAD, will continue to consider the operational requirement for these towers. There is a possibility that, after the ALRI, Automatic Long-Range Input System, becomes operational in early warning aircraft, sufficient reliable coverage may be achieved so that the contribution of Texas Towers 2 and 3 to the air defense system will be reduced. In this event, shutdown of the towers, with the resultant elimination of the inherent risk and saving in money and manpower, may be possible. On the basis of technical advice now available, there is no concern for the stability of the towers, but should the result of the engineering survey indicate the existence of any deficiencies, immediate action will be taken to discontinue their operation." This was reportedly the ADC's first hint that they would at least consider ceasing the program in any way. In the meantime, as a precaution for those still aboard, the ADC would implement watertight escape capsules, 1 per tower, with each capsule, quote, "capable of accommodating 7 persons, with food and oxygen enough to last 15 days. This was in addition to the evacuation procedures being revised. Minimum forecasted weather conditions for prepared evacuation would be reduced to, quote, 50-knot winds or 35-foot waves. However, Soviet fishing trawlers were apparently still an issue, loitering in and around the vicinity. Due to the risks of leaving an entire platform unmanned, command would require a 7-man guard crew remain behind in the event of evacuation. The crew left behind would potentially be allowed to evacuate at a minimum forecast of 70-knot winds using the escape capsule if necessary. As a secondary precaution, the Coast Guard was requested to keep a vessel nearby if a tower is completely evacuated to stand guard from Soviet mariners. In November of '61, it was discovered that scour was having an even greater effect than predicted on both towers. The Atlantic currents had washed away embedment material around footings, exposing them up to a depth of 10 feet. From the historian's report, quote, "All the while the Atlantic Ocean, as if impatient to rid itself of the troublesome towers, attacked them from above and below. Between October 1961 and March 1962, for instance, the towers were evacuated 10 times, resulting in loss of the equivalent of 120 operational days." And for the sake of historical perspective and how quickly nuclear missiles proliferated, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in October of 1962. Then, later in '62, both towers evacuated several more times. Tower 3 suffered the loss of 2 inflatable ray domes, presumably a regular occurrence in high winds, which could explain why you see the ray domes have differing patterns and colors in old photos, depending on the time period they were captured. And I'd actually like to ramble on this a bit. So, even this periscope photo in Time magazine shows what is clearly Tower 4. The above water braces evident along with the 2 dishes on the rear structure, but with a checkered pattern on the ray domes, clearly different from other photos of Tower 4 with solid white colored radomes. It would be very interesting to get clarification. Were these checkered pattern radome covers just that, some sort of severe weather cover, or were they replacements after original radomes were blown off or damaged? Anyway, it was 1963 when that promised ALRI system became operational, which reportedly superseded and replaced the Texas Tower program in this portion of the Atlantic. It was January of '63 when the order came down to finally deactivate the troubled installations altogether. Air Defense Command would ultimately order them completely dismantled. From the historian's report, TT-2 was first to go, being decommissioned 15th of January 1963, then stripped of its communications and electronics equipment. Its 3 legs were dynamited, but the platform, rather than float to shore as expected, immediately plunged to the bottom, denying one salvage company the fruits of its preparations. It was as if the capricious Atlantic, vindictive to the last, pulled down another victim to its murky bottom. TT-3 was decommissioned 25th of March 1963 and shortly relieved of its radars and communications equipment. Special care was taken in mid-1964 to save TT-3's platform, the bottom deck of which was pumped full of urethane foam, then sealed to ensure flotation. On 6th of August 1964, the 3 legs were blasted out from beneath it, whereupon the platform plunged into the ocean. Cork-like, it then rose to the surface, enabling crews to drag it shoreward. Once and for all, the episode of Texas Towers in air defense was brought to a close. The court-martial. The chairman of those subcommittee hearings, back in 1961, was explicit in describing the purpose of those May proceedings, stating, quote, "The subcommittee members are aware that the Air Force is concurrently investigating charges which have been preferred against 3 of its officers and against whom court-martial proceedings may subsequently be instituted. It is our purpose today and in subsequent open hearings to confine ourselves to events from 1952 and 54, when the preliminary studies were made, through to January 12th of this year, 1961, just 3 days before the tragedy. Now, I repeat that the committee has endeavored to refrain from inquiring into the facts in the case which occurred after January 12th, 1961, which was 3 days before the tower fell. Those facts will be a major part of the matters in dispute in any court-martial proceedings that may be held, if they are held." While Tower 4's commander did have the authority to order emergency evacuations, there were multiple issues with this. First, evacuation was near impossible during severe weather events, given that the towers had little to no survival gear or means to escape safely with January temperatures into freezing waters, raging winds, and monstrous waves. Evacuation required either helicopters, which had to land securely on deck and take passengers aboard, or via support vessels using the platform's crane and donut, swinging out over the water. These methods were just not possible in severe weather in the time period, so evacuation needed to be performed ahead of time based on weather forecasts, or simply keep the crew off the platform during storm seasons, both of which required approval from command. And in the Tower 4 collapse, it was approval that never came. In fact, Tower 4's commander reportedly saw these potential issues, yet superiors on shore did not grant his many requests to evacuate crews in a safe, timely fashion. This did not go unnoticed. Roughly 2 months after the collapse, charges were brought against 3 officers total by a major general of the 26th Air Force Division, Syracuse, New York, specifically for those reasons. Officially, a Colonel Banks, acting commander of the air defense sector overseeing the tower, was charged with, from the Sarasota Journal, quote, culpable negligence, involuntary manslaughter, and specifically, violations of Article 92 dealing with negligence of dereliction of duty of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. 2 other officers were brought up on similar charges relating to violations of Article 92. A Major Shepard, commanding officer of the 4604th Air Support Squadron, and Major Stark, the squadron's XO, or executive officer. Quote, the charges against Banks deal with the death of a sergeant and failure to order the 14 Air Force men and 14 civilians off the tower, which had been severely damaged by previous storms. Maximum punishment under the involuntary manslaughter section of Article 119 is 3 years at hard labor and dishonorable discharge. Maximum punishment under Article 92 is 3 months hard labor and loss of pay for 3 months. Colonel Banks, a decorated World War II ace, maintained his innocence throughout. It was reported that Major Shepard, quote, failed in his duty to evaluate the situation and make recommendations in the event of severe storm conditions, and that, quote, even Colonel Banks' superior, Brigadier General Elder, who had received reports of damage to the tower from time to time, had no means with which to evaluate those reports through any engineering support. Essentially, meaning to say that Banks had no engineering advisor on his own staff. Defense attorneys also arguing that a weather officer, Major Sayer, had not provided required weather reports at 72, 48, 24, and 12 hours prior to the storm's impact. However, according to the New York Times, quote, Major Sayer testified that he had reported such conditions to Colonel Banks beginning January 13th. And quote, testimony disclosed that a rough plan had been adopted to evacuate the tower and that a tentative date of February 1st had been set. In addition, Brigadier General Elder, according to the New York Times, quote, told the court that no civilian engineers had ever told Colonel Banks the tower was unsafe. This process took several months, coming to a conclusion in August of 1961, with Colonel Banks and presumably Majors Shepard and Stark fully acquitted, found not guilty on all charges of dereliction of duty. After being stripped of equipment and dropped into the ocean in August 1964, Tower 3's platform was towed to Kearney, New Jersey, to be scrapped by Lipset Salvage Company. Towers 2 and 4 became well-known dive sites, despite the decades taking their toll. From the Courier Post, it's been reported that, quote, on July 4, 1999, the head of the Texas Tower Association led 2 boats to the site from Point Pleasant, New Jersey. One boat was filled with family members of the victims, the other with divers. The mission was to honor the tower's casualties by affixing a brass-plated plaque to one of the tower's legs. They held a memorial service for the victims, and, as each name was read, a bell was rung twice. The plaque lists the names of all 28 men, as well as 4 others who died in accidents aboard Towers 2 and 3. The plaque is fastened with stainless steel bolts to a ladder near the tower's A leg, a good spot for divers to view it. 50 years after the collapse, in 2011, those 28 who gave their lives would finally receive presidential recognition. This effort was said to have been started by Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts 11 years prior, in the year 2000, helped along by the Texas Tower Association's tireless efforts to keep the unsung heroes and their story alive. In the letter from the White House in 2011, addressed to the Texas Tower Association, quote, "For over 2 centuries, our nation's sons and daughters have watched over her shores with unwavering patriotism and quiet courage. As you reflect on the 28 airmen and civilians who lost their lives half a century ago in this tragic event, I hope you take pride in your efforts to remember their service and sacrifice." In his closing statement during the hearings of May 1961, the chairman of the subcommittee, Senator Stennis, stated the following: "I thought that before closing we certainly ought to express our great regret and respect, as well as the utmost appreciation of the committee, the Congress, and the country for the service of these 28 men and the sacrifice that they made for their country. I think that they deserve the same recognition, the same credit, as do those persons who died in actual combat, in time of actual war, and in battle. It certainly was a battle station to which these men were assigned, and we bow in appreciation of their service and respect to their memory." I'd like to mention that we've kind of gone back to the, quote, massive production format, where a single video ends up being like this one, an hour plus in length and information dense. Over the summer, you may have noticed the release cadence was a bit more frequent, and while I'm very happy with how those videos turned out, it just seems more natural for those of us writing to kind of dive headfirst into a long-form video of epic proportions, so to speak, especially for me. These longer format ones also seem to be more well-received anyhow. But since this channel is fully independent and doesn't take corporate sponsors, or really sponsors of any kind, on videos like these, it's our viewers, subscribers, and supporters helping to make this possible. Thank you. And a special thanks goes out to those top-tier supporters on Patreon: Virtual Germo, Uday G, The Handkerchief, Synergizerer, Steve, Someone on Earth 598, Skip N, Robert G, Peyton, Paul Z, P Rush, Paul Rohrbaugh, Owen W, Nicholas E, Michael M, Meg T, Maximum Hats, Maxim K, Mark W, Manuel M, Lisa J, Library of Scars, Kyle W, Justin S, Joshua S, John A, James L, Hayden Taylor, Green Sea Ships, Emily, Drew Ram R, David M, Colin D, Christian T, Carolyn, Captain Ron S, Bruinchus, Broken Spectrum, Brendan C, Brandon W, Bradley B, Bonesaw, Bless Smalls, Andrew M, Andrew F, Alex S, Alex N, and Aaron M. And don't forget, your safety matters.